Good evening, everyone. We are about to start our presentation tonight. Hello, and welcome to our presentation tonight, The Earth in Her Hands, conversation with Jennifer Jewell and guests. My name is Jessa Barzilay, and I am the Director of Learning and Engagement here at San Francisco Botanical Garden. Thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm really excited about this presentation and honored to be virtually sharing space with our presenters today. Admittedly, this presentation was conceived and planned in a different time and with different context. Today, in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic and a civil rights movement, there are undeniably important topics which should and must influence our conversation here today and all of our conversations. Research shows that gardening is healing. And at a time when Black people are disproportionately affected by COVID-19 and disproportionately policed, at a time when the constant, exhausting fight to simply live within systems built on racism, public gardens and parks have a special responsibility to ensure equal access to the healing they offer as such that we are as much a resource to the Black community as anyone else. SFBG supports the fight against racial injustice and recognizes that gardens like ours are not places to escape. They are places for conversation, they're places for refueling, and they're places for change. With that, I'm just really excited for this conversation. I'm thrilled to welcome Jennifer Jewell, Gardner, creator, writer, and host of the podcast Cultivating Place, and the author of The Earth in Her Hands, 75 Extraordinary Women Working in the World of Plants, released just this past March. Joining her today are Leslie Bennett, creative director of Pine House Edible Gardens, and Kara Newport of Filoli Historic House and Garden, who we will learn more about in conversation with Jennifer. Jennifer, Leslie, and Kara, thank you so much for being here. Jennifer, we'd love to hear about the path you took to get to this book and the inspiration to create it.
Well, thank you very much for hosting and for being a space of conversation and potential change. I'm very glad to be here with both Leslie and Kara. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and start a little program to walk you through some more about the book and information on me before I turn to the other women with me. So I believe that gardeners and gardening and gardens are powerful intersectional spaces and agents for potential change in our world. I acknowledge without equivocation that gardens are also places of incredibly entrenched racism and systematic and systemic violation against Black people, other people of color, and the environment in many cases. But I also believe they are profoundly situated to not be those things and to be spaces for change. My public radio program, Cultivating Place, Conversations on Natural History and the Human Impulse to Garden, is predicated on those beliefs. And it seeks really to get beyond the printed page and the images of what our gardens look like or what we as gardeners look like in order for us to be able to talk about what they make us feel like and what they mean to us, these gardens and this act of gardening. And I hope that we're able to talk about that based on what they mean to us and how they feel to us, both individually and communally. In these conversations, one of my highest goals personally is to elevate how we talk about gardens and gardeners, and to expand how we think about them and how we value them. Because gardening has always been about more than growing a rose or a runner bean. It is about growing the world we want to live in. In 2017, Timber Press came to me and asked if I would be interested in writing a book about women in horticulture. And I accepted that request with those lenses in mind: expansive conversation and expansive, meaningful lenses, not about how to, but why, and why does it matter? I spent the entirety of 2018 researching and writing the book. And in it, I explore with the women that I was interviewing the idea of what it is to be at work in the fields of horticulture, which you see, some of which you see listed here in front of you. And these women came from a wide range of both ages and experiential backgrounds and geographies. And for many, many different reasons, each of these women have been called to combine her love and her knowledge of plants and horticulture with a bigger purpose in this world. In a world that I think we can say without equivocation again needs a whole lot less sexism. This is inherently sexist to write with just women as my focus and my voices. And I have to hope that it is sexist for a reason. And that reason is representation broadly. The book focuses not just on women who are changing our world through their horticultural knowledge and passion, but also on a great diversity of those women. And that too is about representation, because representation applied with an ever greater equity born of greater awareness has the chance to change everything. Sometimes purposefully, and sometimes just by virtue of their passion or their purpose in life with their plant work, focused on a goal often very personally meaningful to them. The women in the book provide a fantastic example of how just one woman in a space where there was not one before has the possibility to change so much. Just one woman, let alone a Black woman or a non-heteronormative woman or a young woman or an old woman, has the chance, by being in a position, to change what access to that entire field looks like. And by being there on the inside, she also has the chance to change what the decision-making at that table looks like. She has the chance to simultaneously change, based on her experiential diversity, change the values and the priorities that that decision-making table is bringing to bear on their actions. And with that, she is able to change what leadership looks like. And when you change what leadership looks like, you have the seeds to sow the possibility of changing cultural norms and communal well-being and social justice, by which I mean racial justice and economic justice and geographic justice. And you have the chance to change environmental health and economic health. It is like a trophic cascade of benefit and access and representation. The choosing of 75 women was a conceit. Of course, it was a conceit. It could have been 500 women. It could have been 5,000 women. Maybe it should have been. I had 75. I had 1 year. I had no budget to travel. So you are going to look at this list of women. You're going to read this book and you're going to say, I cannot believe you forgot her. How come you didn't include her? And my answer to you is, consider this an invitation. Consider this a plea to add every single name you can to this list. Find their voices, find their work, amplify them, lift them up, and support them in their work. That is how we begin to see change. Across time and space, what we do in our gardens has the potential. No, it doesn't just have the potential. It does change the world, and it changes the world that we are growing. So it is up to us to really intentionally choose how we grow the world we want to live in. I am here tonight with two such women, two women doing this kind of work. The first is Leslie Bennett, creative director and founder and owner of Pine House Edible Gardens and founder of Black Sanctuary Gardens. She is based in Oakland, California. I am also here with Kara Newport, executive director at the Filoli Historic House and Garden. I am really glad to be with you both tonight. I thank you very much for sharing this space with me, and I would love to have the two of you introduce yourself to us. For this, I'm going to stop sharing. I want to once again thank very much the San Francisco Botanical Garden for the opportunity to have this conversation and the trust and openness that it involves for us to all be at this table. I'd love to start with you, Leslie.
Okay, hi. Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you to the San Francisco Botanic Garden, and thanks to Kara for joining us as well. Yeah, I have 7 minutes, and would love to tell you a bit about myself. As Jennifer mentioned, I'm the owner and creative director at Pine House Edible Gardens, and I've been Pine House is a design, build, edible landscape firm. So we design, build, and care for gardens all around the San Francisco Bay Area, and have been doing that for the last 10 years. I think the suggestion or the invitation was to tell a little bit about our journey and sort of how we came to be who we are. And I do always enjoy telling my story. Because I think it's a pretty unlikely story of a gardener, and it's also been a fun journey. I'm going to ask Jennifer to just wave at me or something if I start hitting my time limit. It's also kind of a long story, but anyways, so a few sort of brushstrokes and narrative are that I'm born and raised in Palo Alto, so a Bay Area native. I'm a daughter of immigrants. My mother is white and English, and my father is Black Jamaican. And I grew up pretty suburban and pretty sort of standard, disconnected from food, nature, all those things that happen to us Americans these days. My mom was an avid gardener and always tried to get me out there, and I always would disappear. That remained a favorite story that she would tell over the years. I pursued, I think very much, and we'll, I'm sure, come back to this later, but very much as a daughter of immigrants, I was not encouraged to become a gardener. I was encouraged to succeed. And success meant working really hard. It meant going to really good schools and becoming a professional, which I did. And so I went to Harvard, I went to Columbia Law School, I went to University College London and got an advanced degree in law. I became a lawyer. And along the way, I studied environmental justice and land use. My focus in law was land use law. But anyways, I became a lawyer, and I became a very unhappy lawyer. I didn't last for very long as a lawyer, about a year and a half. And I think sort of along the way, I got hooked on, I started to realize that land was what I cared about. I remember when I was young, as a Girl Scout, I always loved the nature ID. I knew all the plants, and my mom and I did that together. I've always had this connection with the land. I started the Earth Club in high school, but I just kept pushing it to the side. And then eventually, as I was sort of delved into land use law as my law degree, I ended up working for the Foreign Agricultural Service in England, writing about English landscapes and how they are informed by agriculture and collective identity around hedgerows, collective identity around the landscape. And that is specifically in England around like, what does the English landscape look like? It looks like rolling green meadows and hedgerows, and what does that mean to the people? And people ramble and walk, and it's very much enmeshed with their identity. And I just found that super interesting, and I ended up writing a lot about it in policy papers and other papers, all from a very academic angle. And I remember one day I was interviewing a farmer, and she said, you know, have you actually ever been to a farm? Do you know anything about what you're talking about? And I realized that I was that person. I was that really, really distant, let's call me, overeducated intellectual sitting in a government office in the capital, trying to say something about agriculture and landscape. And so she invited me out to the farm. I loved the farm. It was my first farm visit. I was 27. And all of a sudden I realized that's where I wanted to be. And I'll fast forward a little bit. I experienced a lot of racial discrimination in my law firm. I left my career due to sexism and racism, became severely depressed, and really at age 29, 30 was floundering, just wondering what to do. And I turned toward the land. I started first in my little backyard pruning roses, which was an extremely comforting, therapeutic exercise for a highly depressed person. I started volunteering. As I got better, I started volunteering on permaculture farms and realized how happy I was on permaculture farms in the UK. Then when my time came to move to the next step, I decided I wanted to move to Jamaica and learn more about that side of my family, and I found an organic farm to volunteer on. And that sort of began 3 years of farming. Learned, and I just really wanted to become more useful. I wanted to get out of my head and into my body, learn how to grow food, learn what it meant to feel more connected to the land. And that journey took me from Jamaica, this farm in Jamaica, took me to Northern California, where I landed in Nevada City, working on a CSA farm, and then working with a Gardner who was doing edible landscapes up in Nevada City. And so over the course of 3 years, and it was, you know, born of much pain, but it was it was a huge blessing to be able to be there and to learn. I learned how to grow food. I learned a ton. I healed, and I credit the land and the plants with that. And I decided that I wanted to bring what I had learned, that is the power of healing and the power of knowing how to grow food and work with plants, to more people. I moved to Oakland. I moved there specifically because I knew there was a Black community there, and I wanted to work with a community that included Black people. I founded my business and started doing edible landscaping. Really with the base, but my number one priority was just to meet people where they were and to try to give them whatever their first step was to become more connected to the land. And I felt really strongly, and still feel really strongly, that food is such a huge way to connect with the land. Beauty is such a huge way to connect and feel value for something. And that those are two really clear channels to pursue. Sort of 10 years later, I really started from scratch, just figuring stuff out, trial and error, and have done that now for 10 years, and really love what I do, have gotten to be good at what I do, and have been able to incorporate other elements into my work. And I mentioned food and beauty. I think another area that I started tapping into was cultural heritage and sort of our ancestral plant allies. Who did the people before me and my family and my lineage, what plants did they connect with? And for me, a lot of those plants were things that I was familiar with through my childhood trips to Jamaica. My father had always made fever grass tea for me. Lemongrass is what we call it here, when I was sick growing up. But suddenly I knew what that plant looked like and how to grow it. And that just felt like a really huge connection for me. And it was something I wanted to bring to my clients. And so I did. I started asking my clients, what plants matter to you? What does your grandmother what do you remember your grandmother growing? Is there something that you love? Why do you love it? And trying to just incorporate those plants into the garden. Sometimes even if they're things like lilacs that don't really have any business growing in California. But I think they're really important, even as a gesture, to connect to the place that we came from where lilacs did maybe make sense. So I've been through a process with that in my gardens and have really found that has added a whole nother level of just meaning to the gardens that I've been able to create. How's my time going, Jennifer? I'm getting there. Okay. All right. So I'm almost done. So I've been doing that, loving it, and then along the way, definitely feeling really strongly that I wasn't comfortable. I realized that most of my clients were wealthy and white, and that was sort of what landscape design looked like in this country. And I had a huge level of discomfort with that. Just feeling that I was certainly meant to share my gifts and to serve all people on this planet. Looking around, it was pretty clear that there's some really big structural issues going on, around racism and systemic racism and white supremacy in this country, that affect things like land access, that affect generational wealth, that affect income disparity, and that is why it's very easy as a landscape designer to just create gardens for rich white people, and that's kind of what happens as you get better. And so I have spent a good amount of time trying to disrupt that in my own practice, and to financially just create a funding path where I've had sort of an equity program, an informal equity program within my business, where I would take funds from my standard projects and divert them to help support the creation of gardens for Black people. I've been fortunate in my own personal life to have Black women in my community who have really modeled for me just this idea of Black women are my priority. Like, I get to choose that. I get to choose that I'm going to support women, and I'm going to support Black women especially, and I get to do whatever I want, and that's why I run my own business. And so it's been really exciting for me, difficult and exciting, and I think just building over the years to be able to realize that I can actually structure my business as a structural response to some structural problems in this country. So direct funds to support the creation of gardens for Black women, which I started doing in 2018, and started calling that the Black Sanctuary Gardens Project. And I think the whole other layer there, and the first Black Sanctuary Gardens project was for a garden in East Oakland for a community leader that I knew. The second Black Sanctuary Gardens project was for myself, because I realized how crazy it was. I was doing all this with no garden. Of course, I didn't use any public funds for that, but what was interesting is that I started also to incorporate, or not started, but I got to incorporate the same cultural elements into the Black Sanctuary Gardens spaces. In my own garden, I was really creating this garden for my family and my 2 young children. And I had this very clear idea that I wanted to create a garden that told the story of who my children were. This is what I'd been doing for all my clients, but it felt much more crucial to tell that story correctly, or I don't know what the word is, strongly, for a Black boy being raised in this country. There are so many narratives out there that are going to tell my Black son who he is and what he's about. I felt that as a mother, it was my job to bring what I do, which is create gardens, and use that to serve his story. Making. And so I built our garden full to our family, and he's 4 years old now, and I plants that make us who we are. And I'm now moving on to now for this year, I'm starting some new projects with the Black Sanctuary Gardens space, and I'm excited about continuing that journey. It really feels like an opportunity. The term decolonize is pretty popular. It feels like an opportunity opportunity and space where I get to decolonize gardens and, you know, I let go of the idea of these new things and trying to figure out what matters, what story I want to tell, and what that garden is going to end up looking like. I will stop there, but hopefully that sort of introduces him. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We had a little bit of technical difficulty right there at the end, but I think we got most of it. I really appreciate you sharing that incredible story. We will move now to Kara. Kara Newport, tell us your story. And I know we're a little bit over time, but I think it's to good purpose.
Well, great, thank you. And I also want to thank the San Francisco Botanical Garden for hosting this wonderful conversation. And I'm so grateful to meet both of you virtually and be part of this conversation today. I was saying to Jennifer earlier, I had hoped to hear her speak twice in the spring. So to be part of a conversation with her is just really, really exciting. And to meet Leslie, who's right across the bay here, is a new friend for sure. But to tell a little bit about my history, I kind of almost the opposite story of Leslie in many ways. I grew up in a very small town in Ohio, outside of Dayton, Ohio. Both of my parents came from really impoverished Appalachian background, and so they grew up very agricultural and agrarian, which we'll talk about later. But you know, that's not the way to be. You need to get out of that that sort of space. And so they moved to Ohio from Tennessee, and to raise their family in a better situation. But I still grew up on a small farm, a sheep farm in Ohio, and in a very small town. So it was always the aspiration to leave, to get out. You know, that's the goal, and to learn. I was the first college graduate in my family, and I went, you know, pretty close to home, but a good college. And my journey really, you know, the journey of self-awareness is an interesting thing. So in college, I went in to be a landscape architect, but learned very quickly that my drawing skills were not up to par. It was pre-technology or pre-real technology, and actually my drawing instructor said, the only thing you can draw is plants. What does that mean to you? Why is that the case? And I loved plants, and at the same time I was taking a botany class, and I loved my botany class, and so it just clicked with me that this is my path. But it was botany, not horticulture, so I took a very hard science turn in my training, which I loved. I was one of 5 women in the program, and that wasn't that long ago. So the sciences weren't too friendly either for women. No minorities. Even at that time, there were some minorities on staff, so that was interesting. But it's still a small rural school in Ohio. And so it was a very, you know, kind of structured, rigid training, and I was really feeling kind of oppressed, I guess. And I took an internship at a public garden my junior year, almost on a whim. I just wanted to go somewhere else. You know, it wasn't really about what I wanted to learn. I wasn't that enlightened, I guess, at that point. But it changed my life. It changed my trajectory. It changed everything about what I wanted to do. It was the first time that it really occurred to me that everybody didn't know about plants. You know, that was an aha moment to me, working in a public garden, and that they had to learn about them. Like, that was so surprising. It was just such a space I didn't understand. I thought that everybody came from this kind of agricultural small town. Didn't everybody grow their own food? I thought that was the backbone of how we grew up. And so that was shocking to me. And also interesting because it became a really important point that I had a knowledge base that was completely unvalued by my family, that I could share and that I could connect with. And so it sent me on a different path. I had actually, that fall, I got accepted to a PhD program in botany that I turned down. I turned down being a scientist because I decided to go through the law graduate program, which was a degree in public horticulture management. And it was in some ways my way out of science, so that I had to have a job, I had to have a career. It wasn't optional for me. So it was my way to move away from science, but connect to people, because the hard science was very isolating and very oppressive in many ways. So I took that turn at that point. And then through that, I actually opted, I thought I was going to pursue a career in facilities. That really made a lot of sense to me. I grew up on a farm, I can fix stuff, that would be great. And I actually got an interview one time, and it was, I'm still in graduate school, I'm still finishing my program, and the interviewer said, I'm calling you because you're a young woman. Why would you want to do this? So I got the interview just so they could find out why I think I could have a job in facilities. In retrospect, it's probably a good question. I would have been fighting an uphill battle. And it really was a point at which I thought, maybe not all battles are made to be fought, and maybe I should choose a different path. And all the while I had been writing grants. I did that as an undergraduate. In my lab, I wrote grants for National Science Foundation and other granting agencies in the lab. I was a decent writer, so I kind of fell into it. And then I thought, well, maybe I should try fundraising. And then that was actually the moment where I realized that, fundraising was a great example of where 80% of the field was women, and a small fraction of that in the leadership was women. So, the true glass ceiling of most of the development departments at that time were ran by men. That's changed since then. But I sort of took that on as my own personal challenge. So I did a development career for the first part of my career, but stayed close by. Did development for a zoo, a science center, and then ultimately moved into the director space when I got a job in Charlotte, North Carolina at the Daniel Stowe Botanical Garden. And I think that when I think about my awareness of community impact and what you have to offer and how you can make a difference, I was a business leader first in my own mind, but at the Daniel Stowe Botanical Garden, we built an orchid conservatory. And it was really the moment at which, I knew plants and people connected, right? And that was really important to them. But it was the moment at which I realized that it was a cultural connection, that it was cross-cultural, that you could really have an impact, because in building an orchid conservatory, we had people from all over the world come in. Charlotte's pretty small still, but we had people from different cultures, from different backgrounds, and coming in and talking about that they saw this plant in their home and that was so special to them, and that they could come inside and they could see things growing in places that they had grown up and that they had lived, and it provided, it was like the whole family would come and look at it and experience it. And I think, that was really exciting to me to experience it firsthand, and to be part of that, the people's joy when it came to plants. And a piece I want to jump back to a little bit is just that, along the way, one of the things I realized is kind of as Leslie did, is that family connection. So my grandmother had Alzheimer's and so was deteriorating through, my life. But she always knew what season it was, even up until she died. She planted and moved her plants and propagated. She had an 8th grade education and lived in the middle of nowhere in Tennessee, and was so connected to the land that even at the end of her life, that was part of her survival. So, knowing that and having that in my heart, and then seeing the people's reaction to their own family's journey, and then knowing my own, I think that it really positioned me well when I come to a place like Filoli, which was very intentional on my part, and start having conversations about how do we move beyond the dialogue of this place built by white men. How do we break that down? How do we make the connections? I think that, for me, I see more opportunity than barrier. Certainly there are barriers, but I think that's part of the challenge, because we have to really get creative. We really have to dig in We really have to find the connections, and we really have to be open to new interpretation of these spaces. I think that's what it's really about. And also changing the timeline, I think, is really important when we look at gardens and gardening. It's not just about the garden that has been placed on this land. It's about the land first, and it's about how we can connect to that. So that's my story.
Well, Kara just jumped right into the, which is great because, and I am very aware of the time, but, you know, I am riveted to hear both of your stories. And, you know, in the beginning of the program, and this talk with the two of you, I use this word very specifically, intersectionality, and it is, you know, I think at this moment in time, it can really sound like jargon and just like a word that you put on everything and call it good. But it really means something so specific on the ground in our lives. And it's what I see as the importance of our cultural literacy and gardens playing a part in that. And they have long been kind of excused from that, I think. And which is not beneficial to anybody. And so I really want to, you know, both of you have started talking about this, but, and Kara, you ended on it really quite beautifully in terms of like bringing it all together at Filoli, and how do you take that history, take it back further so that we're expanding our view of how we see it, and then how do we choose all of the intersections that come together there and use them not as keeping our blind spots in place, but as reframing our garden views. Because I think that is where we start to dismantle the structures that hold all of us back, but very specific, holding back in a lot of cases. Because Kara did get started on that, Leslie, could I go back to you and ask you in, you know, a sadly short amount of time to tell us kind of as tangibly as you can, like all of those intersections that you brought to the story you shared with us, how do you use them to then reframe these garden views?
Yeah, sure. And let's see. I think that, you know, I know a lot of people who are maybe more radical progressives than me who don't even use the word garden because it's so loaded with colonialism. And it is so heavy with that. I think for me, I do use it, but I think about, I don't know, what the garden is for me. And I guess the areas where I intersect with it are very much, let's see, I'm very much as a mother, like my garden, the drive behind creating my garden is was to create something for my two children, or two young children, aged 1 and 4, and to create an actual physical space for them that was meaningful. And as I mentioned, that would help them to tell the story of who they are and who we are. So that's a big line for me. I think as a Black person, my background is Jamaican, not African American, so it's a slightly different narrative than what a lot of folks are familiar with here. But it did include slavery, and it did include being forcibly taken away from land, being resituated, and then having a really complicated relationship with the land over time. And, you know, to this day in Jamaica, farmers and people who work with the land are very much looked down on in a way that is very much tied into colonialism and slavery and the sort of leftovers of that. What else? What are other things that I think for me, it's been a space, the garden is a space where I can, as a daughter of immigrants, it's a space for me where I get to think about my background, the English and Jamaican parts of me. Both of those lineages have really strong land-based roots that are different. and that also met, I actually named my business Pine House around that idea of pine houses were the pineapple conservatories that were built in England by the Victorians when they were so enamored with pineapples and other tropical and subtropicals, and took them from Jamaica, kept them as special collectibles in England, and gave them sort of a different value than they originally had in their original place. And that's obviously a really difficult connection, but for me, I thought it was really interesting. It was this horticultural moment, or it was a moment where a plant connected across two cultures, and there's a story there about colonialism that is my story. Yeah, I think I also mentioned like the mental health and healing. Like I feel like the whole mental health space, that's what a garden means for me. It is healing, but it's sort of, I love that you introduced this conversation, Jennifer, or maybe it was Jessa, something about like a garden not being a place to look away, or to step away from it all. I think it's healing to actually look at the things, and they're all there. They're all there in the garden. And I think as a nation, that's what we're being asked to do right now as well, is to, find the spaces in our lives where all these things come together and actually look at them instead of looking away. I love what you're saying about Filoli, how it, going back to be like, whose land was it before it was the white wealthy man's land who built the place. Anyways, is that answering? I think that's what comes up for me when you ask the question.
Kara, anything else come up for you there? Because clearly we don't have time to, like tie this all up with a perfect bow. It is like offering out some of our questions and the ways in which your pathways and my pathways have been some confluence, and what do we do with that, and how do we go forward from that? Kara?
Yeah, I think the thread I'd like to pick up on that Leslie was talking about is land access. I think that it is an interesting cycle, right? That to be agricultural, as was my family's experience, is lesser in some way, that you want to move out of an agricultural state, that the people who are agricultural look down on. But yet they, in many cases they had land, and in many cases they didn't. They worked other people's land. That's my family's background as well. But now, in current times, especially places with Filoli, that's one of the things that I think we have to offer is land access. We are held in public trust. We are a public institution, as is the San Francisco Botanical Garden and other public gardens. We're in a public space, and I think your notion, Leslie, of Black sanctuary gardens and how important that is for not just healing, but carving out a space, I think, and telling a story. I mean, I think that's so compelling. And I think that, and when you think about a space like Filoli, we are in a lot of ways put upon lands that were tended by Native peoples, that were tended by others for many years, Spanish settlers, Mexican settlers. There's such a story of the history of the land. And I think what we really need to make sure of is that story continues in the future. I think with a historic site like us, there's such a temptation to say, oh, and now we're preserving it right here, and it's over. The conversation stopped. And really propelling that conversation forward is where we are right now. And there's such an opportunity to do that, and to do things in a different way. We're conveniently renovating our edible garden. And what opportunity is there to make that a place of convening, to make that a place of new conversation, to make that a place that tells untold stories. I think that's really important. When we talk about where we're going, where does this journey lead us? I think we just have to be open to it being different, a different place. And that's what having different voices at the table, that's what having women at the table tends to bring out. We're pretty good at that, sharing the voice and sharing the story and amplifying our colleagues. And I think that we can help with that. Public gardens can be a space for that.
Yeah. And,
yeah, and I'll sort of, oh, I was just going to jump. I think that's so exciting to hear. And with my background in historic preservation and landscape preservation, it's so interesting that's white men running that show, and they get to decide, what's important. What is in England it was like, what's a grade 2 listed building in the States, what is a national site, what is of value to our culture, and then how we're going to preserve it and what it's going to look like. And I think just hearing you say that, Kara, it's just such a good reminder of having other people in charge, women of color, Black women, all of us, just brings in so much space to assign value to other stories, and then to make space for them and flesh them out and see what they look like and have them become our stories.
Yeah. And I personally, I've definitely been part of the debate over whether we should call them gardens or not, with the incredible amount of baggage that comes with the word. But I'm really attached to reclaiming that word in its bigness, not its littleness. And I may be dissuaded of that over time, but I'm going to fight for the reclaiming of that word for all cultures and peoples. I think that maybe now we should move to a question and answer time. Jessa, if that is where you think we are ready to be.
Yes, thank you. This has been wonderful so far to listen to you all. We do have a question here. The question is that, Jennifer, you ask in the book, each woman you interviewed, who were the women that inspired them? And Leslie's response in the book was all women who were enslaved in the United States that tended to gardens, grew and made food, and made Black and American culture what it is today. So the individual's asking, who were the women or the woman that inspired you, Kara, and you, Jennifer, in the journey into the world of plants?
I'll let Kara go first.
Thank you. I had mentioned before my grandmother, certainly. She was one heck of a gardener, and she provided food for 11 children out of her garden. They didn't buy store-bought food. They didn't have money for it. So 100% of what they ate, they grew for most of her adult life. And so that's really inspirational. And of course, my mother, who carried on that tradition and taught it to me, maybe a little grumbling about it, but you learn along the way. And then professionally, I just want to give a shout out to Judy Zook, who was the director of the Brooklyn Botanic Garden when I first visited, and was one of the first in our industry, and just an amazing leader. And she's since passed, but I carry her wisdom with me often. I think of the challenges she had that I don't have because of her. So I'm so grateful for that, and other women leaders.
Yeah. Well, for me, it was certainly my mother who grew me to be a gardener in every sense of the word. And I didn't realize that it wasn't something you were supposed to be proud of. It was a source of pride. And I remember, my sisters actually might be listening to this, but I remember once my mother saying to me, well, you are a gardener. And I was just like, I mean, she could have told me I had just won the Nobel Prize. I wouldn't have been more proud. But I will say that, the joy of that question, Jessa, to hear Leslie answer that question for the book, and to hear Kara answer it now, I would just say the joy of asking that question and hearing those diverse answers from the women in the book was such an illustration of the strength of mentorship, and holding really firm to a belief that if somebody opens the door for you, you damn well better keep that door open for all of the women coming behind you, and in all of their diversity, because that is how we make sure that representation across all kinds of intersections is far more equitable.
Great, thank you. There are no other active questions here. If anyone else who's listening would like to throw one out, we do have time to take another one or two. otherwise, I have a question for you all. Jennifer, I guess I will ask it of all of you, but what's the next step in your journey? What is your next project you're tackling?
Oh, I'm not sure on my end, except for to keep trying to find my own blind spots and to keep interrogating myself around what it is to garden and be a gardener. And hopefully as I do that, it helps other people who are in the garden with me virtually and really do the same. And
I think there are some new questions now too that have popped up.
oh yeah.
There are. Let's go ahead and take a couple of those. So one is specifically to Kara. How do you think turning a once private garden public changes its meaning? How do you bring that meaning to the present?
Well, it's a great question, and and interesting about Filoli specifically is that it was actually it's been a public garden longer than it was owned by either of the owners, but we have such barriers on exclusivity, right? We haven't invited people to come, although the message is out and more people are coming, so that's really exciting. But I think the question about how to bring that meaning current, I think I don't know is really honestly the answer. I don't know what the path is going to be, and I think that's actually the good news. If I knew, and if I set the path and said this is absolutely what it needs to be, then I'm basically recreating the past. And so I think that how you bring meaning is by letting it be a living thing, letting it be organic, letting it happen a little bit naturally, have some guardrails on the side, but charting a path forward and sort of letting it evolve a little bit. Filoli's launching a master plan right now, and we've brought in an external firm, and we're looking at all the history and really trying to sort through that with a different lens. I think that's really important. So looking at the past in a different way, and then looking more toward the future from different people's perspectives. As I was saying before, like it's not just one voice; it's many voices.
Excellent. Thanks. All right. Another question is, if we were to throw the word gardens out, what other word might you all use?
I haven't considered abandoning it myself, so I don't have a ton of ideas. But one of the people I work with suggests she uses the term working with the earth, and so she describes herself as a person who works with the earth, and she works with the earth, and that sort of communicates the grounding element and what's happening, but without tapping into the colonial history of the term gardening.
And a term that we've been using in some of our conversations is land tending. It's a term that's typically attributed to Native peoples, but I think that it has a broader use and application, which is very much what you just said, Leslie. And I think that being of the earth and connecting with the earth and not putting upon. I mean, I think that's the challenge of gardens, right? Is that they put upon a space sometimes, and they're not authentic to that space, and that's sometimes the beauty of them. That's the beauty of Filoli, is that you feel like you're somewhere else. It's transportive, but it's also put upon, and it's artificial, and it needs a lot of water and things that don't work really well in California. So how do we tend that land a little bit differently and find that balance?
Yeah, and I think both that land tending and stewardship is another word that's similar to that. And one of the things it does is it removes the noun, so that it's not an object that can be owned. It's a relationship, and it's a process. So you tend, or you can be a tender, or you are tending, or you are stewarding. It is stewardship, but it's not It's not, you can't objectify it, and you can't buy it and sell it. It's a relationship.
Wonderful. Well, I know that we're starting to get close to the end of our time. We've just had a nice, wonderful rush of questions. If we don't get to your question, we will be able to go through them after this is over and respond over email. So thank you all for contributing. Great questions. But I want to, since we're talking about books and celebrating Jennifer's book here, there's a question about what books are you all reading right now?
I have a very large stack of garden books, but I am also in the middle of White Fragility, which is a genius read that if you look like me, you should be reading.
And I'm laughing because I started reading White Fragility too, because I have a white mother who left it on the coffee table here. And I do have a lot of white privilege as a light-skinned, a really educated Black person. So I'm also flipping through that. Yeah, that's, and I have 2 kids under the age of 5, so I don't really read these days very much. Kara?
Well, I have to say I'm an avid reader, but this pandemic sort of put a damper on it somehow. So I'm currently in between books, so I'm looking for recommendations.
Let's see. Yeah.
All right. With this wonderful just moment here with Leslie's, one of Leslie's little ones, there's a question here about how to motivate children of all backgrounds. And I'm assuming this is about motivating them towards an interest in plants and gardens. And this seems like a perfect opportunity to think about and speak to our future here. How do you guys do that in thinking about how to connect children to gardens?
I'm happy to talk about that with this little one here. I've been, it's actually been probably one of the things I'm happiest about and most proud in the last 3 months of shelter in place. We've just been in our garden. So I think, first of all, just making the space and then being there. And I've been just so thrilled with how my son has, I feel like he's like, I'm going to tell him what your mom told you, Jennifer, like, you are a gardener. He's so into the idea of seeds, and he is just experiencing, he has an apple tree that we dedicated to him. And I think that's actually been a huge thing for him. We planted the tree, we put his placenta under it, we told him it was his special thing, we did a little ritual, and it is his tree. He's really into that. And the other day he was eating an apple and he said he wanted his little sister to have an apple tree, and so he took the seed out and he planted it in a pot, and it actually spread. I've never done that. I wouldn't have even thought to do it because I just buy grafted trees, but he took it back to basics for me, which I appreciate. Sprouted, which is for some reason to me miraculous, because I just I never thought of growing trees that way, I guess, since I was 5 and read Johnny Appleseed or whatever. So anyways, it's really neat the way he's just gone with it. And then we're walking around eating loquats in the neighborhood and talking about the seeds, and now we have a bunch of loquat seeds sitting and sprouting. And I was so proud of myself. I should be proud of him, but I'm really proud of myself. We were at my parents' house for a week, and he came back. He said, we were headed home, and he said, "Mom, I'm so excited to go home and check on my vegetables." I said, "You're doing great, buddy." And it's kind of amazing. It's kind of amazing how, I don't know, just talking about it with them, doing the seeds, it's, it is like osmosis. I tell him a lot of things. I told him about aloe vera, and he was really psyched about that, and the idea of this healing plant. And now when we're looking at other aloes, he's like, "Oh, is that a healing plant?" And I'll say, "No, it's another aloe. It's part of the aloe family, but it's not so healing." And he's just very interested. So it's interesting how little things catch their interest and then they run with it. And that's what I have to say about that. But there's lots of potential.
I would like to add just one little piece from Filoli that's been kind of remarkable to me. We have really constricted mechanisms of interacting with children. You know, it's through programs and things like that. So it's a small space, and we're, you know, finding ways to expand that. But what has been fascinating to me in years is teens coming to the garden, and that's been really exciting to me. And just like, you know, laying on the grass, because they don't really have grass in their yards, and that's kind of back to the land access, and just talking and walking and being part of the garden and in the space has been really exciting to me. I think it's a, you know, I think it's a reflection on this next generation, who I really love. I think they're amazing, and I think that just allowing it, and not necessarily even encouraging it, but just allowing it to happen.
Yeah. I think the one big thing that came to mind for me with both my girls when they were little and as they are now, which is 20 and 18. And that is, I think we as adults and parents tend to overstructure everything. And if you just let them out into the space, and even if you're a little worried that they're going to eat dirt or get stung by a bee, or, like, I don't know, eat a poisonous plant or get a prickle, just let them do it. It's good. It's good. And they know in their cells what to do when they're out there. And if you just leave time and space for it, they'll do it.
Well, thank you. I think that kind of brings us to the end of our conversation today. It was so refreshing to spend this time with you all, to hear what you had to share. Thank you so much for being a part of this. And I hope there's been some connections formed between those that already existed and new connections. And I hope that our listeners today really felt a connection too, and are interested. There's lots more comments about interested in taking some steps into gardening themselves, or into these similar career paths. There's some great ideas about future collaborative books about the future of gardening and about children from all backgrounds. So our listeners also contributed maybe some tidbits of what our futures could look like. But I want to thank everybody again. It was really wonderful. And we're going to end on a slide. If you were really motivated by what you heard today, or inspired to support any of the work of these organizations that these women represented today, we will end on a slide. Again, I want to mention that we will get to some of these other questions over email. But in the meantime, I wish everybody well. Please take some time to be outside in the next few weeks. Make sure that you're getting some of that much needed healing, and take excellent care. Thank you very much.
Thank you.